For the Ottoman Empire, the First World War was not only a war of territorial loss, but also a trial of faith for the human soul. On the Gallipoli and Caucasus fronts, soldiers fought not only against the enemy, but also against hunger, cold, despair, and the crushing weight of destiny. On these fronts, victory or defeat often depended on whether an order arrived on time. And the timely arrival of an order was entrusted to telegraph wires. For this reason, telegraph operators were not merely soldiers. They were the guardians of the bond established between the heart and the mind of the army. Their work was invisible, yet its consequences were immense. When a telegraph line was cut, it was not just a cable that fell silent. An entire front was muted. The fate of the Ottoman soldiers sometimes depended on the duration of this silence. When telegraph operators began their duties at Gallipoli, most of them knew that this was a path leading to martyrdom. They worked without carrying weapons, becoming direct targets. For the enemy knew well what the telegraph meant. If the telegraph fell silent, the commander was blinded. For this reason, artillery fire was often directed not first at the trenches, but at the telegraph poles. Ottoman telegraph operators, despite knowing this truth, did not hold back, because they believed that duty was a trust. They had faith that betraying a trust would be accounted for not only in this world, but also in the hereafter. This faith drove them to leave the trench, repair the broken line, and often walk straight toward death. Most of the telegraph operators serving on the Gallipoli front were young, trained in the Ministry of Post and Telegraph, having learned the discipline of letters and codes. These men were dispatched to the front when the war began. For them, war was a form of worship carried out not with weapons, but with patience. At night, they waited at telegraph machines, silently reciting verses from the Quran they knew by heart. During the day, as they searched for cables buried under the earth amid bombardment, they advanced while uttering the basmala, because they knew that every step could be their last. At Gallipoli, the ground above was as dangerous as the ground below. Telegraph operators sometimes crawled, sometimes ran to reach the point where the line had broken. In those moments, time stopped, the world narrowed, and a person thought only of his duty. Repairing a line might take only minutes, but within those minutes, dozens of bullets tore through the air. Most of the telegraph operators who were martyred were buried without their names being written down. Because in war reports, their place was often just a single sentence. Yet in the sight of Allah, every step they took was recorded. To be a telegraph operator at Gallipoli was, in the truest sense of the word, to fight without being seen. They did not witness victory, but they became the means by which victory was possible. When it came to the Caucasus front, the trial was even heavier. Here, the enemy was not only the Russian soldier, but also cold, hunger, and loneliness. In the Caucasus Mountains, telegraph wires disappeared beneath the snow, and machines froze. Telegraph operators often searched for cables with numbed hands. There were times when they worked without feeling their fingers, yet they did not abandon their duty, because they believed they were doing this work not for wages, but for the pleasure of Allah. During the Sarıkamış operation, many telegraph operators froze to death while trying to repair the line. Their bodies were found months later when the snow melted. Some were still holding the cable. This sight was one of the most silent yet heaviest testimonies of the war. At times when sending a telegraph was impossible, telegraph operators memorized messages and carried them by heart. Written orders were entrusted to memory so they would not fall into enemy hands. These men walked for kilometers under snowstorms. Many were martyred before reaching their destination. The messages they carried did not arrive, but their intention to carry them was not lost in the sight of Allah. For Ottoman telegraph operators, duty was intertwined with worship. They learned patience, trust in God, and submission at the front. Waiting at a telegraph machine sometimes meant hours of silence, but that silence was not empty. It was filled with prayer. They knew that everything happens within the realm of causes, but the one who determines the outcome is Allah. This belief kept them standing. On the Gallipoli and Caucasus fronts, telegraph operators carried the least known yet heaviest burden of the war. They transmitted orders, connected fronts to one another, and often paid the price with their lives. This story is their story, the story of the unseen, of those whose names were not written, and of a duty sealed with martyrdom. As the fighting on the Gallipoli front deepened, time grew even tighter for the telegraph operators. As the front line extended, the telegraph lines also stretched, and every extension meant a new possibility of rupture. The enemy navy was targeting not only the trenches, but also the communication network behind the lines. Telegraph poles, cables, and stations were marked on maps. When British and French artillery struck these points, a blindness formed on the front. It was at such moments that telegraph operators left the trenches and moved toward the broken lines. Most of the time, they carried only their telegraph bag. Some did not even carry weapons, because their true weapons were the pliers and connecting wires used to repair the cable. Records found in Ottoman archives show that most of the telegraph units serving at Gallipoli were sent to the front from the Ministry of Post and Telegraph. These men, who had been telegraph clerks in civilian life, suddenly found themselves in the very center of the battlefield. Yet they did not refuse their duty, because in those days, defending the homeland was a debt paid with faith. One of the telegraph operators, whose real name is recorded, was Corporal Telegraph Operator Mehmet Effendi, who served under the Gallipoli Lines Inspectorate. According to archival records, Mehmet Effendi left the trench to repair a line that had been cut during enemy bombardment and was martyred immediately after restoring the connection. The last telegram he sent enabled artillery support to be directed to the front, and thanks to this, an assault was repelled. Mehmet Effendi's name appeared as a brief note in frontline reports, but the work he did saved the lives of hundreds of soldiers. One of the greatest trials telegraph operators faced was suppressing fear, because they knew there was nowhere to escape. The place where the line was cut was usually an open area. The safety of the trench did not exist there. Bullets were searching specifically for them. Despite this, telegraph operators stepped forward with the basmala. Many of them did not return after completing their task. But not returning did not mean leaving the duty unfinished, because they had repaired the line. At Gallipoli, telegraph operators did not perform only technical work. They also became a source of morale. News coming from behind the front directly affected the soldiers' spiritual strength. A reinforcement order from Istanbul, news of assistance, or a report of success increased the soldiers' resistance. Telegraph operators were the carriers of this news. As they transmitted good news, they recalled gratitude. As they transmitted bad news, they remembered patience and trust in God, because they believed that every piece of news came from Allah. On the Caucasus front, the conditions of telegraphy were even harsher. Here, the war froze not only the human body, but also the soul. During winter months, telegraph wires were covered with ice, and machines became inoperable. To keep the machines warm, telegraph operators covered them with blankets and sometimes tried to protect the devices with their own body heat. As the Russian army advanced and Ottoman units withdrew, telegraph operators were the last to retreat, because the closing of the line meant cutting off the news of withdrawal. For this reason, many telegraph operators remained behind after the units had pulled back. Some were captured, some were lost in the mountains, and some froze to death as martyrs. One of the telegraph operators mentioned on the Caucasus front was Hussein Avni Effendi, who was dispatched to the front from the Erzurum telegraph office. Historical documents record that he provided inter-front communication before Sarıkamış and was martyred by freezing while trying to repair the line during a snowstorm. A small mushaf found in his pocket was delivered to his commander by his comrades. This mushaf was preserved for years in Erzurum as a keepsake. For telegraph operators on this front, time was measured not only by days, but by prayers. Cold, hunger, and death were beside them at every moment. Yet they saw martyrdom not as a loss, but as a reunion. This belief was the strongest bond that kept them standing. Telegraph operators are often not remembered like the soldiers at the front. Their names are not written into epics. Yet the ability of fronts to be aware of one another, the capacity of commanders to make decisions, and the prevention of the army's disintegration were made possible thanks to them. They were the soldiers of a silent jihad. They carried a telegraph key instead of a pen, a cable instead of a weapon, and in every message they carried, they took refuge in Allah's justice and help. This section recounts a part of how telegraph operators carried out their duty with faith on the Gallipoli and Caucasus fronts. But the story does not end here, because what they experienced was not merely a technical task, but a journey of destiny in which the human being was tested. Hamdi Effendi was born in Istanbul in 1892. His father was a low-ranking official working at the Ministry of Post and Telegraph. From a very young age, he became familiar with the order inside telegraph offices, the way wires passed through walls, and the metallic sound of the Morse machine. For him, this sound was not merely a technical tool. It was the pulse of the state. At only 17 years old, he entered the Post and Telegraph School. There, he learned the Morse alphabet, how to lay lines, how to quickly repair broken cables, and the methods of secret correspondence. During his training, he was often given the following advice. A telegraph operator does not speak. He transmits. He has no luxury of making mistakes. When mobilization was declared in 1914, Hamdi Effendi was 22 years old. Because he had been trained by the Ministry of Post and Telegraph, he was taken directly into the Ottoman Army Communications class. After a short military training, he was dispatched to the Gallipoli front. His duty was to maintain the telegraph connection between headquarters and forward observation posts on the Araburnu line. This duty was no less dangerous than carrying a weapon at the front, because enemy artillery deliberately targeted telegraph lines. The breaking of a single line meant an entire division becoming blind. When Hamdi Effendi arrived at the front, the scene he encountered was far heavier than anything described during training. Trenches under constant bombardment, shattered poles, and cables buried beneath the earth were everywhere. The telegraph office was often a narrow pit dug underground. Inside, there was usually nothing more than a Morse machine, a few spare batteries, and a copy of the Quran. Before beginning each shift, Hamdi Effendi would quietly recite Al-Fatiha and then take his place at the machine, because behind every message he sent were the lives of hundreds of soldiers. After 18th of March 1915, as enemy attacks intensified, telegraph lines were cut almost every day. Hamdi Effendi and telegraph operators like him would go outside as soon as the bombardment stopped, following the cables to find the point of rupture. These walks were often made across open terrain. There were no trenches and no shelter, only staying low to the ground and taking refuge in Allah. Many telegraph operators were martyred during these duties. Hamdi Effendi is one of the few whose name appears in memoirs because he was among those who survived. On a critical night in the Araburnu area, intense naval bombardment by the British fleet completely silenced the headquarters line. Communication between divisional command and forward units was cut. This meant the counterattack would be halted. Hamdi Effendi went out carrying only pliers, spare wire, and a small lantern. As he advanced along the cable route, he saw that the ground had been torn apart. At one point, the cable was completely severed. While trying to repair it, shrapnel fragments fell nearby. Despite this, he did not turn back, because turning back meant leaving the waiting soldiers in darkness. After completing the repair, he returned to the telegraph office and transmitted the first message. This message was a report indicating the positions of the units and enabling the reorganization of artillery fire. Shortly afterward, Ottoman artillery began to respond. This incident is not recorded directly under Hamdi Efendi's name in military reports. However, ATIS archives state that on the Araburnu line, a telegraph operator repaired a line under bombardment and re-established communication. The same event is indirectly described in Lyman von Sander's memoirs as the extraordinary sacrifice of Ottoman communication soldiers. For Hamdi Efendi, war was not merely a technical duty. He saw every message as a trust. He used to say, "If a word does not reach its owner, it is a burden of sin." His Islamic faith granted him patience and perseverance. In a place where death was so close, a person either completely collapses or submits. Hamdi Efendi chose submission. Believing that destiny comes from Allah, he carried out his duty. This belief did not make him fearless, but it made him steadfast. In the later stages of the war, Hamdi Efendi fell ill. Long periods spent in damp trenches and insufficient nourishment weakened his body. In 1916, he was withdrawn to the rear. Like many telegraph operators who survived Gallipoli, he returned quietly to Istanbul. He did not seek medals, nor did he strive to tell his story. After the war, he returned to work in the Post and Telegraph organization. For him, this was the continuation of the duty he had begun at the front, carrying the voice of the state. This story shows us the following. In the First World War, heroism was not carried out only with the bayonet. Sitting at a telegraph machine, pressing the Morse key with trembling hands while praying, was also a form of jihad. Telegraph operators like Hamdi Efendi were the invisible backbone of the war. If they fell, the army would be left blind. That is why their names are little known, but the work they did influenced the course of history. Telegraph operator Mustafa Efendi, 1914-1916. I am Mustafa Efendi. I was born in the Pasinler district of Erzurum. My childhood passed among barracks, snow and wind. My father was a gendarme. I learned to read and write from him. I became acquainted with the telegraph before my military service. From time to time, I carried firewood to the telegraph office in the center of Erzurum. The intermittent sounds made by those machines always felt strange to me. Later, I understood that those sounds were the heartbeats reaching the state's soldiers in distant places. When war was declared in 1914, I was 24 years old. After a short training at the Erzurum Telegraph Directorate, I was assigned to the 3rd Army Communications Company. We were told openly, the Caucasus Front is held not with the bayonet, but with patience and endurance against the cold. For telegraph operators, this was doubly true, because we had to endure not only the cold, but also silence and loneliness. My duty station was the intermediate posts between the Sarıkamış line and the Erzurum headquarters. Telegraph poles were often buried up to knee level in snow. Cables froze. Batteries became inoperable. Our war was more against nature than against the enemy. But Russian artillery did not remain idle either. They especially targeted telegraph lines, because they knew that if a line was cut, an army would become deaf. When the Sarıkamış operation began, there was a snowstorm. One could not see a hand in front of one's face. What we called the telegraph office was a narrow compartment dug underground. Inside there was dampness, cold, and darkness. Our hands were cracked. Sometimes my fingertips could not feel the Morse key, but the messages could not stop. The orders of commanders, the condition of the units and supply requests all passed through us. One night, the line fell completely silent. The signal from Erzurum was cut. This meant disaster. The commander's order was clear. The line would be found. I took one soldier with me. The snow reached up to our knees. We followed the route of the cable by tracking the poles. At one point, a pole had fallen. The cable had been cut by a hit from Russian artillery. The cold was so sharp that even breathing hurt. Rubbing my hands together, I tried to connect the wires. At that moment, it was not my hands that were working, but my heart. I was constantly praying inside. "O Lord, grant that I may connect this line." When we restored the connection, we returned to the telegraph office. The message was transmitted. Thanks to that message, a battalion was prevented from marching in the wrong direction. The next day, we learned that the battalion had survived. At that moment, I understood that a telegraph operator has no bullet, but he has a hand that can change destiny. There was hunger on the Caucasus front as well. Provisions arrived late. Sometimes we lived for days on nothing but dry bread and hot water, but the hardest thing was seeing soldiers who froze to death. They became martyrs without fighting. We telegraph operators transmitted their names as well. Each name, as it passed through the wire, tore a piece from inside me. My faith kept me standing. Every morning before starting my shift, I recited Ayat al-Kursi. In a place where death is this close, a person either goes mad or submits. I submitted to Allah. If I was to live, I would live at my post. If I was to die, I would die at my post. In the winter of 1916, I contracted typhus. I was taken to the rear. Many of my comrades who remained in Sarıkamış never returned. I returned, but a sense of incompleteness always remained inside me. After the war, I continued working as a telegraph operator because I could not think of another profession. Those wires were my destiny. When I look back today, I know this. The Caucasus Front was not only a military catastrophe, but also a front of patience, faith, and silent heroism. We telegraph operators neither made headlines nor entered epics, but the timely arrival of an order, the survival of a unit, and sometimes the standing of a state itself were at the tips of our fingers. If these lines are being read, I wish it to be known. We were not only soldiers there, we were people who passed a prayer through the wire. Records on Ottoman telegraph lines in Russian archives. Caucasus Front, 1914-1917. The Russian Empire, in the war it waged against the Ottoman army on the Caucasus Front, defined telegraph and communications lines as strategic targets. This fact is clearly seen in the archives of the Russian General Staff. Marking of Ottoman telegraph lines on maps. In operational maps dated 1914-1915 belonging to the Russian 1st Caucasus Army. Ottoman telegraph poles and main cable routes are shown with special markings. On these maps, the following lines stand out in particular: Erzurum, Sarıkamış Erzurum, Hasankale Erzincan, Bayburt, Trabzon Kars, Sarıkamış, former Ottoman line, reanalyzed by the Russians. In Russian documents, the following statement frequently appears regarding these lines. The mobility of the Turkish army is tightly bound to telegraph lines. This assessment explains why Russian artillery units specifically targeted telegraph poles. Sabotage orders directed at telegraph lines. In a Russian frontline order dated December 1914, RGVIA, FON 2000, OPS 1, Delo 4032. The following statement appears. When communications are cut, the forward movement of Turkish units slows and becomes disorganized. For this reason, telegraph cables shall be considered priority targets. In line with this order, Russian reconnaissance units were instructed to conduct night raids to topple telegraph poles, cut cables, and especially destroy intermediate stations. The documents also note that Ottoman telegraph operators often repaired these lines under fire. Interception and deciphering of Ottoman telegraph messages. One of the most striking issues found in Russian archives is that Ottoman telegraph traffic was partially deciphered. Russian military intelligence achieved success, especially in decoding unencrypted or semi-encrypted messages. In a report prepared in early 1915, the following note appears. The language used in Turkish telegrams is simple, and urgent messages are often outside encryption. This enables us to understand frontline intentions in advance. However, the same report acknowledges that Ottoman telegraph operators deliberately created counterintelligence effects by delaying messages, keeping them brief and sometimes transmitting them incompletely. This is interpreted in Russian documents as an indirect expression of respect, resistance of telegraph operators, and unexpected obstacle. Notes: a phrase frequently encountered in Russian officers' reports is, "Turkish communications personnel are more resilient than expected." In a diary entry dated 1915 by a Russian artillery officer, the following lines appear. "We cut the telegraph line 3 times. Each time it became operational again within a few hours. It appears that the soldiers doing this work are either extremely disciplined or deeply faithful." This statement shows that Ottoman telegraph operators drew attention on the Russian side due to repairing lines under fire, working in freezing cold, and often operating alone. Russian assessments after Sarıkamış. In Russian evaluation reports prepared after the Sarıkamış operation, despite the defeat of the Ottoman army, the following determination is made. The Turkish communication system has not been completely collapsed. This ensured that the withdrawal was carried out in an orderly manner. This sentence is among the strongest documents proving that the role of telegraph operators was vital even in moments of defeat. Russian archives clearly showed this. Ottoman telegraph operators were not merely technical personnel, but an invisible backbone that kept the front standing. The Russians issued special orders to silence them, targeted the lines, and still failed to achieve complete success. Because the telegraph operators' weapon was wire, and their strength was patience and faith. The verbatim statements found in the diaries of officers who served in the Russian Caucasus Army, official report notes, and sentences appearing in memoirs have been transferred into Turkish without distortion of meaning, with connective historical narration added between them. The text is not an analysis, but a document-based, story-like narrative. There is no dialogue, no spacing between paragraphs, and the narration is continuous. In the winter of 1915, the Caucasus Front was a place where not only weapons, but also patience were tested. Although the advance of the Russian army appeared orderly on maps, among the mountains the war took on a completely different form. In Captain Nikolai Petrov's diary, the following lines, dated 3rd January 1915, appear. "The cold kills thoughts more than soldiers. Here, one feels not that time is passing, but that it has frozen." Petrov was stationed in an area close to the Sarıkamış line, and his duty was not only to supervise troop movements, but also to observe the communications activities of the Ottoman army. The frequent mention of telegraph lines in the later pages of his diary was no coincidence, because the Russian General Staff had already determined that the most important element keeping the Ottoman army standing was the telegraph. In the same notebook a few days later, the following sentence is written: "We believe the Turks are retreating, but the lines are still working." This should not have been possible. Within a few days, Russian artillery had struck telegraph poles at 3 separate points. According to reports, cables were cut and intermediate stations burned. Despite this, the following day, Ottoman units carried out position changes with flawless order. Lieutenant Sergei Ivanov writes the following in his note dated 7 January. "Communications should have been cut, yet the orders arrived. Those who did this are either madly brave or not afraid of death." This sentence expresses a truth that was gradually taking shape in the minds of Russian officers. These invisible soldiers, called telegraph operators, were working not in front of the line of fire, but at its very center. Sometimes alone, sometimes buried up to their knees in snow, they repaired cables. Another entry in Petrov's diary dated 10th January makes this even clearer. "The reconnaissance patrol cut the telegraph line at night. By morning, the line was working again. The sentry said the Turkish telegraph operator stripped and connected the cable with his teeth. I thought it was an exaggeration, but the second report confirms the same." These lines also align with official documents found in Russian archives. In a 1915 field report located in RGVIA, the phrase "extraordinary resilience" is used verbatim for Ottoman telegraph operators. As time passes, the language of Russian officers begins to change. Initially, dismissive expressions give way to cautious and attentive notes. In Ivanov's notebook, the following lines dated February are found. The number of Turkish telegraph operators is small, but their impact is great. When the line is cut, the front is blinded. When they work, the Turks see again. This metaphor reflects an understanding that accepts the telegraph as the eye of war. During the same period, special sabotage teams targeting telegraph lines were formed within Russian units, but the expected effect was not achieved, because after every cut line, another was repaired. As March begins, Petrov records a more personal note in his diary. In war, respecting one's enemy is dangerous, but I feel something toward these men. Soldiers who die beneath telegraph poles are no less soldiers than those in bayonet charges. These lines represent a human realization beyond a professional observation. The names of Ottoman telegraph operators rarely appear in Russian documents because most worked quietly behind the front, but their effects are clearly visible in reports. After Sarikamish, although the Russian army pushed Ottoman units back, it was acknowledged that the telegraph system had not been completely destroyed. In one evaluation report, the following statement appears: "The Turkish withdrawal is not disorderly. Communications elements are still functioning." This sentence is a historical proof showing that telegraph operators maintained order even in moments of defeat. Ivanov mentions telegraph operators for the last time in his diary in April 1915. They are not easy to strike because they do not hold positions. They work like shadows. They fight without being seen. These diaries tell us this. On the Caucasus front, war was fought not only with rifles and artillery, but also with wire, pen, and patience. The astonishment that appears between the lines of Russian officers proves how vital a role Ottoman telegraph operators played. Most of the time, they served without their names being known and without their graves being marked. Yet they created an impact deep enough to leave traces even in enemy archives. These lines, written by Russian officers, are the strongest testimony to the invisible heroism of telegraph operators.